Welcome to Fresh Forensics, your go-to destination for everything Linux.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. To follow along with this and other tutorials, visit my GitHub for scripts, logs, firmware, and the full methodology.
Okay, so we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of this IoT device. We've learned a lot about this device already by looking up the FCC ID, by attempting to get a shell on the device over serial. We were able to look at boot logs, almost got a root shell. We have identified that it's running Tina Linux. We've looked at the data sheets for the chip, for the main chip. But now let's look at the SPI flash chip. So what we're going to attempt to do is use what is referred to as a CH341A programmer. These devices are very inexpensive. The kit that I have is perhaps this one right here, and as you can see, it's give or take $10. So these are not expensive to buy. Here's one for $7.99. And what this is going to allow us to do is connect to that SPI flash chip, which on an IoT device is holding everything, not just the bootloader, but the entire operating system. And the chip clip is designed to fit directly over that SPI flash chip. This is not the only device that you can do this with. It's the one that I'm familiar with. I use it because it's cheap and it works. I've never used it to actually write something to a chip or to flash it. That's a whole other story. You can run into some problems with the differences in the voltage of the programmer and the board. So let's go ahead and go over to my Kali Linux system. So right now I have an SSH connection to my laptop that's running Kali Linux. Programmer is plugged into the laptop and the chip clip is connected to the SPI flash chip on the board. So once again, just to quickly recap, we are talking about this chip right here. This is the SPI flash chip, says XMC on it. I have the programmer connected to that chip right now. So one thing that I can do is I can run ls USB, and ls USB will list everything connected to my laptop via the USB ports. And we can see that the programmer is recognized as being connected to the laptop. And you can see right here in the description in the output of ls USB that it is being referred to as a CH341. And that's going to be important because you need to know the programmer that you are using. There are a multitude of different programmers that can be used to flash a chip. The utility that we're going to be using to actually do this is a command line utility called FlashROM. Typically it is already installed on Kali Linux, but if not, it's very easy to install. You simply run the command sudo apt install FlashROM. And I can do an apt info on FlashROM. We'll get back a very lengthy description. It is generally a tool for identifying, reading, writing, verifying, and erasing flash chips, often used for BIOS, EFI, core boot, firmware, etc. So we're going to pull up the help menu for FlashROM by running FlashROM with a -- help. Remember I said to pay attention to the output of ls USB, and that would be important. Here is why. So if we go down to the bottom of the help menu, one of the main things that we have to give this tool is the programmer that we are using. We can do that by doing a -p or the long form, which is -- programmer. And then we need to know which one of these is our programmer. Our programmer is going to be right here, CH341A _SPI. There are no other names in that list that match the output of us running ls USB. and that is the one that is going to work for us. So that's one of the main things you need to identify. So with that important bit of information, I'm going to go ahead and run the command sudo flashrom -p for programmer, and I'm going to give it the name of the programmer that we are using. And I know you see some additional information on that screen. We're not going to look at that just yet. So this would be the first command that we run. So I hit enter, and immediately we get some output back. The main thing that you are looking for is going to be for the programmer to identify the flash chip that we are using. So it found the flash chip on the board. It's an XMC flash chip. This is the identifier for the chip. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. You can actually get a list of all of the various chips by running flashrom with a -L. With a capital L. And it will give you all of the various chips that you could possibly be interfacing with. But we have the name of ours, and we don't need to go any further. So now I will rerun that command, and now we're going to add a -C for chip, and we're going to give it the name of that chip in quotation marks. And then finally we're going to do a --read to read the firmware from the chip, and we're going to dump the firmware to a file, and we give that file a name, and I'm going to call it doorbell firm.bin. This will take a couple minutes to complete. Okay, so it has finished flashing the chip. Let's go ahead and do an ls, and we see that we have our firmware doorbell firm.bin. I'm going to get a quick size of this in human readable format by doing ls-lh, and we see that it is 16 megabytes in size, which is pretty typical of the firmware of an IoT device such as this one. Now, generally it is a good idea to actually do this twice, just to make sure that there haven't been any errors and that you have actually read the entire contents of the flash chip correctly. So generally when I'm doing this, I actually do it twice. I compare both firmware images with one another and make sure that they are identical before I move on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rerun that command, and I'm going to give this second firmware image the same name but with a -0, and hit enter. We'll let that run again, and then we will compare the two images and make sure that they are both identical. And if they are, then I feel confident that we have the entirety of the firmware image and we can move on to the next step. Okay, so the second flashing or reading of the flash chip has completed. So let's go ahead and compare both images. We'll do ls-lh, and I'll put an asterisk in there, and we see that both the images appear to be identical, 16 megabytes in size. By doing ls-l with an asterisk, we can actually get a more granular output in size, and we see that both of them are in fact identical, 167.77216. And we could even go further with this, and we could do a diff of the first firmware image and then the second firmware image, and we get nothing back, letting us know that there are absolutely no differences between the two images. So with that out the way, we can now start the next step in the firmware security testing methodology, and that is going to be to analyze the firmware. I have a copy of the firmware on my main machine. I no longer need the Kali Linux machine, so I'm going to exit from that. Okay, so here we are. We are on my Ubuntu Linux machine. I have created a directory called Doorbell to hold this firmware, and here is our firmware, doorbellfirm.bin. It is 16 megabytes in size. So we're going to go ahead and begin the process of analyzing the firmware. First command that I would run is going to be the file command, and we get back that this is a sysx file. It's a little interesting, but nonetheless, okay. So the next command that I would probably run realistically would be strings, and there's many different ways that we can run this. We could run this with absolutely no options, and we're going to get back a lot of strings from this image. I just run strings on the image with no options, and you see we get back quite a bit of information. And a lot of this is going to be useless to us, specifically stuff like this right here. This is not going to serve us any purpose. So it is at that point that we would probably want to use the -n option and give it a number such as 10. And what that'll do is that'll pull any human readable strings from the firmware image that is at least 10 characters long. And we could just run the command like that and take a look at the output. Realistically, we probably want to save this to look at more in depth. So I would rerun that command, and I would pipe the output into a file and call that file strings-10.txt. Now, if I do a word count on that file, it is 11,421 lines long. We could reduce this size by getting rid of identical strings. So to do that, I would cat out the contents of this file. I would pipe it into sort with a -u, and I believe that's a capital U, and then pass it to a new file that we'll call strings-10.sorted.txt. And it is not a capital U, it is in fact a lowercase u. Okay, so now we have two string files, and the original is over 11,000 lines long, while the new one is a little over 3,000 lines long. So you see what we have done there. Now this is more realistic, 3,000 lines long. We could take a scroll through that. And this is what that looks like. So you're going to see there's a lot of IP addresses showing up in the output. We have references to the SOC chip, all winner. Debug information, versioning information, all sorts of things. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it is definitely worth looking at, as there is always good information inside of these strings. I might do a hex dump, and I'll do a -C and then a -N 512, because we're just looking at the beginning of the firmware image. Sometimes it might be worth it for me to run a utility called img_stat on the firmware image. In this case, it doesn't give me much back. Ultimately, the tool that is going to be of most use to us in this situation, given the fact that we are dealing with firmware, and we know that we are, is going to be the binwalk utility. So if I do apt info on binwalk, we get back that it is a tool used for searching a given binary image for embedded files and executable code. It is designed for identifying files and code embedded inside of firmware images. It uses the libmagic library and therefore is compatible with magic signatures created for Unix file utilities. Binwalk also includes custom magic signature files, which contain signatures for files that are commonly found in firmware images, such as compressed archive files, firmware headers, Linux kernels, bootloaders, file systems, etc. So if you do not have this installed, it's very simple. Just run the command sudo apt install binwalk. And I already have the newest version installed. Binwalk has quite a lengthy help menu to it, but don't get overwhelmed. Most of this we don't need to worry about. First thing that I would probably do is check to see if the firmware image is encrypted. And I can do that with binwalk by running binwalk with a -E followed by the name of the firmware image. Low entropy means it is not likely to be encrypted. High entropy means it is likely to be encrypted or compressed in some way. And what it does is it generates an image for you to look at, and this is going to be low entropy. So you see that we have lines going up and down. If it were going up and going straight across, that would be high entropy and indicate that it is likely encrypted. So what we are looking at is low entropy and a good sign that we don't have to deal with encryption. Okay, so we've now made it to the next step in the firmware security testing methodology, and that is going to be extracting the file system. So this stage involves looking inside the firmware and parsing relative file system data to start identifying as many potential security issues as possible. We're going to extract the firmware contents and review the contents of uncompiled code and device configurations. We could do this manually, and we could do this automated. We're going to do this in an automated way using binwalk. I'm going to clear up some more real estate on my screen. I'm going to pull up the help menu for binwalk again so we can take a look at some of these options. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run binwalk on the image without extracting it. I just want it to parse through the image and output to the screen what it finds. The only option I'm going to include is going to be a -t option, and that is going to be used to format the output to fit the terminal window. So let's go ahead and run that. I'm going to do binwalk, -t on the firmware image. And this is very interesting because the first thing that we see on the first line is that binwalk is finding an Android boot image. It's very weird to me. It has compatibility with Android. It even says that it has ADB installed on it. So nonetheless, very interesting that it's coming up as an Android boot image. But we can see that we have some ELF executables. We have compressed data. We also have struck gold. This is what we're really going to be looking for once we get inside of this image, and that is going to be the squash fs file system. The squash fs file system is where all of our main files are going to be located, similar to on a Linux system. That's where everything is going to be stored. So that's going to definitely be of interest to us. We also see that we have at least one JFFS file system. So with that out the way, let's go ahead and unpack this. We're going to run binwalk with a -e, and I'm going to do a V, and that's going to be it. I'll give it the name of the firmware image, and let's go. And there we go. That was actually quicker than I thought it would be. So we have 411 signatures. We have a couple warnings, some symlinks that point outside of the directories, which is typical. So let's go ahead and clear the screen. Now if we do an ls, we have this directory that has been created. We cd inside of that directory. And do an ls, we're starting to see some file systems. So I see a couple, multiple squash fs file systems. Some of these are probably just repeating. So probably the first one to look at is going to be the squash fs root. Guarantee some of these are repeating each other. So let's go ahead and cd into squash fs-root. I'll run the tree command, and this will tell us how many directories and files we have from the top parent directory down. So we have 41 directories and 238 files inside of the squash fs root directory. Quick way to see what the other ones look like and how they compare to this one is to just cd outside of that directory, and we'll just run the tree command on each one. So we already ran it on this one, and we saw that we had 41 directories and 238 files. So let's go ahead and run that tree command on each one of the other directories and see how it compares. If I run that on squash fs root 0, we have nothing. So that is basically pointless. If I run it on -1, same exact thing. If I run it on -2, pointless. And if I run it on -3, looks like we have 5 directories and 29 files. So okay, that's worth looking into. So a couple of these directories are completely pointless, and then a couple of them matter. The main one is going to be the squash fs root directory. So let's go ahead and cd back into that, and this will be the focus. If you're familiar with any Linux system, you're going to know that some of the most important files are going to be inside of the etc directory. So let's go ahead and take a look inside of that directory and see what we have. We have a lot of regular files, and then we have some bash scripts inside of this. Definitely very interesting that we have an ADB profile. Very interesting indeed. Cat out the contents of that. Cat out the banner, and that is going to be the banner for our Tina Linux operating system, Tina Linux Neptune. If I cat out the banner.failsafe, we got some special commands going on in here. But let's go ahead and take a look at, I know that you're dying to see what is inside of the password file. So let's cat out the contents of the password file, and what do we have? So we have a root user with a shell on the system. And then we have a couple other users, none of them have a shell. We have a root user with an ash shell. So next thing is going to be to cat out the contents of the shadow file. And once again, we have the same users, and for the root user, we do have a password. I've done this a couple times before, so I already know that this is going to be incredibly simple to crack. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this line right here, and I'm going to go over to another tab and cd inside of that Doorbell directory. And I'm going to create a file called hash.txt. Inside of that, I'm going to paste that line from the shadow file. And Control X, Y, enter. Now I'm going to use John the Ripper. If I do an apt info on John, we get back that John the Ripper is a tool designed to help system administrators to find weak, easy to guess or crack through brute force passwords. This is going to be very simple. We are just going to run John with absolutely no options and give it the name of the file, which is hash.txt. And hit enter. And it took about a second. It ran 16 threads and it cracked the password hash. The password for root is Tina, which makes sense given that it's called Tina Linux, and that obviously implies that this must be the default password and that nobody bothered to change it. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Embedded IoT security at its finest. So we have a root user, and the password for the root user is Tina. Now I can actually cd into, there's a directory that will be created called .john on your system inside of your home directory. Inside of that, you have two files. One is your pot file that stores all of your passwords, and there's our password. But the other file is the log. So let's go ahead and take a look at the log real quick. And this is everything that John the Ripper did to crack this password. So while it seemed like it happened almost immediately, it did do a little bit of work in order to determine this password, and it shows you that in the log. So it actually applied quite a few different rules, things that John the Ripper does in order to ultimately come up with the password, where right here it cracked the root. And there we go. All right, so there's obviously a lot more to understand within this file system that we extracted from the firmware image, but I feel like this is a good point to stop for now. In the next video, we'll pick up where we left off, and we'll continue to explore the file system and progress forward in our firmware security testing methodology steps. Look forward to seeing you there.
If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Linux, cybersecurity, and hacking content. And as always, keep learning
and stay fresh.
I'll see you in the next video.